Hi, how are you? Thanks for coming back. If it's your first time here, welcome to my little channel where I try and talk about things, shine a little light on some interesting, quirky things from history, normally maritime history, sometimes Irish history. In this case, Anglo-Irish history, bit of Indian history too, actually, because the events I'm going to discuss occurred in India. It was a mutiny of an Irish regiment in India in 1920 that a surprisingly few people know about. A lot of Irish people don't know about this. English people, I wouldn't expect them to know about it at all. I don't think the Indians would know much about it. Occurred in the Punjab, in a place called Jalandhar. Involved a regiment called the Connaught Rangers. Now, the Connaught Rangers were established in 1793. Connaught is a province in the west of the country, the west of Ireland. So this regiment basically started, its first recruitment was in Portumna and followed on Galway City. And the regiment was called the Connaught Rangers, but the number it was given was the 88th Regiment of Foot, and spent a lot of time with the Duke of Wellington, who was also Irish, in the Peninsular Wars, where they got a very good reputation. And since then, they fought in the Crimea, in the battles of the Alma and Inkerman, and they fought in the Boer War. In World War One, in the trenches, they were in Gallipoli. They fought alongside the Anzacs for Hill 60 in Gallipoli, and they were a regiment with a good reputation. Their nickname was the Devil's Own, and these events occur in 1920. See, what was happening in Ireland at the time was the War of Independence. If you don't know about Irish history, in the 20th century, at the start of the 20th century, yet another generation of Irish people tried to throw off British rule, and there was a growing feeling that home rule could be achieved politically throughout the early days of the 20th century. But home rule never occurred. It kept getting dangled and promised, but never materialised. In 1916, there was a military uprising in Dublin City by fairly radical members of the Irish nationalist movement. But the British reaction to that basically hardened everybody's attitude. What had happened was the centre of Dublin was occupied by the rebels. There was a week of fighting. After that was over, they surrendered. The leaders were all then executed by the British by firing squad, a couple every morning for a whole week, and that really hardened people's attitudes, and people were no longer happy to get home rule. People wanted full independence. A new political party came on the scene, Sinn Fein. They were much more dedicated to total independence and a republic. This is the old Sinn Fein, not Sinn Fein that's around now, that came out of the provisional Sinn Fein in Northern Ireland. This is the original Sinn Fein that all the Irish parties that have governed ever since kind of came out of. After independence, it broke up, but it was a hugely popular party back then, and in 1918 it swept the boards in the election. Won outside Ulster, it won almost every seat. Won something like 75 out of 110 seats, I think is the figure, and completely dominated the 1918 election. And what the MPs elected did, they didn't go to Westminster. They set up their own parliament, declared a republic. It was immediately declared illegal by the British, so they had to go on the run. But there was a huge movement of national volunteers, as they were called, who were armed and ready to fight. And they began military action against the British and soon called themselves the Irish Republican Army. This is the old IRA, as Irish people call it, that popular movement that had huge support around the country. Now, the British response to this was quite harsh. There were several different paramilitary organisations operating for the Crown. There was the Royal Irish Constabulary, who were basically normal policemen, but also they were the eyes and the ears of the Crown, and their job was to prevent any kind of sedition, as well as dealing with dog licenses and drunks and traffic accidents and so on. So they were kind of caught in the middle. But they were an armed force, lived in barracks. Their barracks became targets because the IRA would like to raid them for weapons and also basically to show who was boss. The IRA had set up their own, and Sinn Fein had set up their own parallel system of courts and everything. So they were trying to establish their own rule in Ireland. And the RIC represented British rule. The British Army was present in Ireland at the same time. They were obviously targets for this new nationalist army. And Britain recruited a special force of people in the UK to come over, and technically they were special constables, temporary special constables, to be a force that would work alongside the RIC, the constabulary. And these people, this force of special constables became known as the Black and Tans, because they were given a mismatch of uniform, dark green and jackets and khaki trousers and that kind of thing, or vice versa, I forget. And because of that mismatch in colour, they were nicknamed the Black and Tans after a hunting pack of hounds that were black and tan. People are very confused about who the Black and Tans actually were. They talk about the Black and Tans as if it was everybody involved, the British Army, the auxiliaries. It was basically originally a force that was special constables, recruited in Britain from basically soldiers who were, out of work since World War One finished and at a loose end. And these people were quite hardened. Generally, they were soldiers, ex-soldiers. They were quite hardened by their experiences in France, so they were quite brutal when it came to reprisals against attacks in Ireland. A second force was the auxiliaries, and they weren't really in play when these events occurred in India, but they were only recruited from officers, ex-officers, and they were supposed to be proactive, going out to try and take the IRA head on. If there was an attack on a barracks or attack on an army convoy, the RIC and the Black and Tans in particular would react by picking up local suspects. Black and Tans would shoot people, torture people, burn villages, burn houses, loot pubs. They basically were carrying on, and they were proving the point that the Irish people weren't UK citizens and weren't being treated as UK citizens. They were basically being treated like they were some kind of unruly tribesmen in some far corner of the empire, and they were to be put down, basically, was the Black and Tan attitude. Now, this was all covered by the English media. There was journalists from UK papers that would report this the next day in the UK if a village was burnt down. And Britain was quite divided about it. It was a big story in Britain. It was a big story around the world, what the Black and Tans were doing. In India, the troops got to hear this through letters from home, through newspapers, and some of them who went home on leave encountered this to their face. So that's what was happening. There was a certain amount of unhappiness among Irish soldiers in the British Army. In this particular regiment, they took it to the next level. What happened was, one particular morning, 4 soldiers were fed up with hearing everything that was happening in Ireland and said they weren't going to soldier anymore for the King.
And they said, I think you're right. And I said, well, it's up for us to do something about it. And they said, what can we do? So I said, Derek, we can do a lot of things. We'll lock ourselves in for the night. And we'll walk over to the guard room in the morning. And we'll hand ourselves up and we'll refuse to soldier any longer for the British government until such time as they withdraw their troops from Ireland and give Ireland her freedom.
So they presented themselves to the guardhouse. It was the end of June 1920. Early morning, they went and they volunteered for the guardhouse, which is a term that means they're basically going on strike. The corporal on duty didn't believe them, told them to get lost. They convinced him, no, they meant it. So he took them inside and locked them up. The sergeant came back from his breakfast. He couldn't believe what was happening. He bawled them out, told them to feck off, go back to their barracks. And they said, no, they were sticking to their guns. So this was the 1st Battalion of the Connaught Rangers. The 2nd Battalion was back in Britain, which was involved in training people to send out to the active 1st Battalion in Jalandhar. They were in Jalandhar in the Punjab, and they also had two small garrisons up in the hills, one at a place called Salon, which will feature shortly, and the other place, name escapes me, but it didn't really feature because the troops there didn't really do anything. But, and by the way, this was India, where there was growing nationalism in India as well. It was only the year before in the Punjab where the Amritsar Massacre had occurred, where thousands of Indians had gathered in a big open square, a sort of a park, to protest the arrest of some activists. And they had been told not to assemble. And the officer in charge, the British officer in charge of Indian troops, had all his men open fire on the crowd after barring the main gate. And as they tried to get out of other exits, they fired for 10 minutes and they killed somewhere like 300 people. Another 300 or so were wounded, unarmed, trying to escape. He had 2 armoured cars with machine guns that he said he regretted he was unable to bring them into the action. They couldn't fit through the alleyways to get a good shot, and otherwise he'd have fired on them as well. They were being fired upon to teach them a lesson, apparently. It was in this environment that these Irishmen decided they were going to no longer fight for the king, and they were only doing in India what was being done in Ireland. So this caused some consternation. The rest of they were from C Company. The rest of C Company, who were present, when they mustered and were told to number off, they decided they were going to stand by the guys who had gone to the guardhouse, and basically there was about 40 or 50 of them who all wanted to be taken into the guardhouse as well. At this stage, D Company were told to go and arrest the guys who were milling around outside the guardhouse, and they refused. And then B Company was at the firing range. They came back and they joined in the mutiny as well. So there you had 400 Irishmen who weren't going to soldier for the king anymore. There was consternation, of course. Not everybody joined in, of course. Not everybody, especially older married men, were much more cautious. These guys were young. Typically, the average age there was 22. So these were young hotheads, basically, who were afraid of nothing, in their prime. And they were very angry about what was happening at home. The officers would have been Anglo-Irish officers, would have been probably predominantly Protestant, would have had much more loyalty to the king and country. But there would have been like everything in Irish history, there would have been a spectrum of feeling among the officers. Some would have been more sympathetic than others. Their commanding officer came to address all the men. The guys were taken out of the guardhouse. They were all assembled. You had these 400 men who were basically not going to soldier anymore. Colonel Deacon, their commanding officer, who joined the regiment from school, who had been through all kinds of campaigns with the regiment and had fought in World War I with these guys. He came, he addressed them, he basically pleaded with them to go back because he said, the implications of this were going to be extremely serious. He had a tear in his eye when he was asking them to not do it, but they persisted, they stuck to their guns. They formed a committee of 7 who decided that they would retain their weapons, they would stand a guard, they'd actually double the guard, they'd put a guard on the canteen and the bar and everything, they'd basically do their duty until they could be relieved, and they would hold down the Union Jack and put up an Irish tricolour that they made themselves with cloth they bought in the local bazaar. They also sent a message with 2 men sent to the hill station at Salon, where there was another 60 or 70 men, primarily from C Company. These men up at Salon, they also decided that they would do the same thing, hold on to their weapons, stand by the mutiny. About 50 of the 60 or 70, about 50 men mutinied. They negotiated with their officers, and they decided they would hand over their rifles. One of the agreements was that they would hand over their rifles, but they would not be guarded by armed men if they did that. They handed over their rifles. It's a bit confusing. The accounts differ a bit. They handed over their rifles at Salon. They were held under guard. They didn't like that. They felt they'd been betrayed. They decided they would go to the magazine, the armoury, and recover their rifles. That evening, 50 men in 2 columns went to try and get their weapons back. The bandsmen of the regiment and some officers were waiting to try and stop them. Shots were fired at the mutineers. 2 of the mutineers fell dead, a third was wounded. So blood was spilt in Salon. Back in Jalunder, they basically negotiated as well that they would hand over their weapons when a relief force arrived, and Highlanders and Seaforth Highlanders and South Wales borderers arrived to basically take over the camp. The men were marched out to an internment camp that had been assembled nearby on a plain, basically bell tents with fences and machine guns set up, and the men were put in there. In Salon, they were taken off to another prison. So eventually they brought them back to the Wellington Barracks in Jalunder, and there they used Highlanders with carrying entrenching tools to go in and separate out these men they wanted, that they were considered to be the hardliners. They separated them out. They took those men back to the camp where the tents had been dismantled. They left them there for 2 days in the heat and tried to get them to relent. They were sticking to their guns. They brought them back to Wellington Barracks. They were in the cells. They paraded the rest of the men outside, and they told the rest of the men this was their final chance. If they gave up now, they could be pardoned. They'd get a full pardon if they gave it up now. In 2s and 3s, some of them started, and then a rush, and then basically the bulk of the remaining men called off the mutiny at that stage. 2 or 3 stayed and said, no, I'm going with the men in the cells. We're sticking by them. So basically there was 47, I think it was, in the cells, and 2 or 3 more joined them. That was the end of the bulk of the mutiny. What was left to be done then was to deal with those men who were going to be charged. The court-martials were held in August. There was 4 separate trials. The Jalunder crowd were separated into 3 groups, and then there was a 4th group which was from Salon. The president of the court-martial was a fellow called Lawford, and he was actually the father of the actor Peter Lawford. The prisoners had no representation. It's conflicting if you look at the books. Some suggest that the prisoners didn't trust any officers that would be assigned to them. Some suggest that the prisoners didn't want to recognise the court. Some prisoners represented themselves. The trials were held. The sentences were awarded after the open section of the trial finished. 14 death sentences, 5 life sentences. 2 people got 20 years, 4 got 15 years, 11 got 10 years, 2 got 7 years, 6 got 5 years, 4 got 3 years, and the rest got 2 or 1 year hard labour. They'd also, everybody would, and the NCOs would be busted down to the ranks, and they'd all be dishonourably discharged as well when they'd finished their sentences. When the sentences were ratified, the prisoners were taken out, they were paraded. The 14 men with the death sentences were stood to one side, and they were told that 13 of those were being commuted to life in prison. Private James Daly, Jim Daly from Galway, was told that he would be executed on the morning of the 2nd of November. There we go. So Jim Daly, Private Jim Daly, 22 years old, from Ballymoe, County Galway. He grew up there. His family moved to Tyrrell's Pass in Westmeath. He had joined in 1919, and he had been he was the leader in Salon who had made the move on the armoury that night when 2 men died. So he was to be shot. One of the reasons he was to be shot was that the authorities were concerned about what might happen if there was a mutiny among Indian troops out in India. So they didn't want to be too lenient. Also, blood had been spilt in Salon, so that was why he was the man to die. Jim Daly was executed in the prison courtyard with all his comrades in the cells, able to stand on the end of their bed and look out the tall windows, the high windows, and see the courtyard. There was a chair prepared, weighted down. There was ropes to tie him in. There was 2 tables with sandbags for the firing party to lay the weapons on, and a priest accompanied him in, and he had a rosary beads around his neck. The men called prayers from the windows as he went to the chair. He declined to be tied in. They put a hood on him and shot him. He was the last man to be executed for a disciplinary offence in the British Army. After the execution, the rest of the prisoners were shipped back to cold British winter, British Victorian prisons. They tried to keep together, tried to agitate for political status for themselves, to define the fact that they weren't actually common criminals, to no avail. Eventually, after Irish independence was achieved in 1923, they were released and they came back to Ireland. Jim Daly's body was returned to Ireland from India in 1970. Now, there was another Galway man at the time who was recalibrating his loyalties, and his name was William Joyce, and he was a teenager in Galway, and he was feeding information about the local IRA to British intelligence in Galway. And when he became under suspicion from the IRA and it looked like his life was in danger, they basically moved him over to England and fixed him up with a position. He enlisted into the Worcester Regiment. It soon transpired he was underage, so he was kicked out. But this guy, William Joyce, stayed in England and he dabbled in politics, and he got into fascist politics, and he became quite a notable speaker in the British Union of Fascists with Oswald Mosley. He was quite well known at the time in that movement, and he fell out with Mosley. He left and he set up his own organisation, which was called the National Socialist League. Soon after that, in 1939, himself and his wife left, went to Germany, and began to broadcast for the Nazis propaganda to Britain. He became known as Lord Haw Haw, and his call sign was Germany calling, Germany calling.
Germany calling.
A lot of people would listen to him out of curiosity, because there was so much censorship. They weren't getting much news in Britain. Out of scorn, to ridicule him, but he was pumping propaganda out of Germany towards Britain. At the end of the war, he was arrested while trying to escape, really. He was shot in the arse, actually, while he was being arrested. He was taken back and he was tried for treason. He was sentenced to death. He was basically killed on a technicality because he'd been born in America. His Irish family had moved back to Ireland. He wouldn't have qualified for a British passport. He would have qualified for an American passport. He would have had to go through several hoops to get a British passport if he wanted. He had actually faked a British passport, given false information, so his British nationality was fake. But because while he was in Germany, he would have had the protection of this fake British passport if he wanted to. Therefore, he was deemed to have been guilty of treason against Britain. So anyway, he was hung. And the day after, there was another traitor hung. The two of them were the last people to be executed in Britain for a non-murder offence. So there you are now. Hope you found that of some interest. 2 Galway men executed for treason, but worlds apart in every other way. There are books about it. you can find a book by T.P. Kilfeather called The Connaught Rangers, and Sam Pollock's book Mutiny for the Cause, and they're kind of sort of, what would you call them, a bit kind of cheesy, kind of playing up the heroic nature of it a bit too much, a bit too some of the language used is a little embarrassing. But there's another book by an English he's a sort of a lawyer, The Devil to Pay, Anthony Babington, and that goes a little bit the other way, slightly cynical of some of the evidence given, and a bit. I think he has a slight sourness about the fact that they reneged on their oath to the king, but he does have an awful lot of detail that is missing in the other books. But like anything, there are conflicting versions of events. Okay, I'm going to interject something here in this video that I filmed 2 months ago about this book. I've seen this book referred to online as debunking the myth of the Connaught Rangers. Maybe not. Maybe it wasn't phrased quite as strong as that. Basically, it's suggesting it was offering some new story, some new version of events that undermined the traditional story. And even on the flyleaf, it refers to it as if it's a compelling yet tragic tale which sadly reflects little credit upon any of the participants. So it seems like maybe it was marketed as being some kind of debunking. But that's not actually what you get from it if you read it. The closest he comes is he does pose the question, why that regiment? Why was there only a mutiny in that regiment? Now remember all the official accounts that you'll see will talk about the 70 mutineers that were charged. It doesn't refer to the 400 originally. He asked the question, why? Was it a case that these were just basically troublemakers who mutinied because they didn't like the work they were forced to do in the heat and tacked on this version of it being for Ireland afterwards? And so he poses that question, but he doesn't suggest any information. He doesn't have anything to suggest that's the case. He doesn't suggest that they didn't put up a tricolour, for example. He doesn't have any statements from officers countering any of the traditional stories from the men. I don't know where or how you can represent it as debunking the myth. One thing he does do is he turns up a document from an officer providing over the court-martial, who in a confidential letter gave his reasons for the mutiny as he saw it. My general impression of the cause was 1. Unrest in Ireland. 2. Letters from home. 3. Very poor discipline indeed of the entirely unintelligent sort. 4. Extremely bad relations between officers and men. 5. Want of satisfactory occupation and activity. And 6. The hot weather. But the first two there, the unrest in Ireland and letters from home, would seem to be exactly why the men say they mutinied. And no doubt maybe it was exacerbated by poor discipline and bad relations with officers and men that no one else seems to talk about. So just be wary of how you might see that book represented. But that's Devil to Pay, Anthony Babington, Mutiny for the Cause by Sam Pollock, The Connaught Rangers by T.P. Kilfeather, if you want to go looking for detail on all that. Right, bye now. Mind yourselves.